So we look at Pitt losing last week to Penn State as expected, pretty much in fashion that we expected. They didn't get annihilated, but it really wasn't that close of a game. We go back 1 week before that, and they really struggled after leading 21-0 against Youngstown State, pull that one out in overtime. So do you have an assessment for us as Pitt gets another difficult non-conference slate? You talk about scheduling non-conference. There's very few teams in the country. I can think of a few. Florida State come to mind with two just extremely difficult non-conference games. But Pitt is one of them because they get the Penn State game. Now they welcome in Oklahoma State this week. So just your thoughts about what we can possibly expect from Pitt and Max Brown this season.
Well, Max Brown was something to be desired in that Penn State game. Much hype around him coming from USC. They were giving him the reins. And there's even conversation whether or not he's going to remain the starter after this week. There are some that wanted to have him not start the Oklahoma State game. So it's going to be another tough top 10 out-of-conference matchup. It is ACC versus Big 12. The ACC feels like they're the better conference. They definitely were last year in the last couple years. But the Big 12 is better again. They're kind of getting back to where they were a few years ago. TCU's getting better. West Virginia's looking really, really good despite the loss to Virginia Tech. Oklahoma beating Ohio State, so that's a Big 12, Big 10 matchup. Baker Mayfield planting the flag down. Apologize for it, but I kind of wish he didn't. I kind of like the swag of Baker Mayfield in Oklahoma. So the Big 12's back again a little bit with the exclusion of Texas, who's still been kind of embarrassing themselves the first couple weeks here. Pitt's going to have some problems, to put it bluntly. I don't see any way they win this game. They're probably going to lose by double-digit points yet again, like they did against Penn State. You give them props for playing great, tough out-of-conference matchups. They didn't do it the last few years, and they were able to have a relatively decent season a year ago with a relatively easy out-of-conference schedule. This year they wake up, and they have a tough out-of-conference schedule. I don't think this was the Pitt team to do it with because I don't think they're that good necessarily. The defense is suspect. Max Brown, completion percentage is something to be desired. It's a Pitt team that is an average team. You also have to remember, but going into the Penn State game, they won, but there was little excitement besides the fact that it was a rivalry with Penn State because they barely beat Youngstown State. They had a big lead over Youngstown State. They crawled out of the game winning in overtime against Youngstown State. So now you got Penn State, who was number 4 going into the game, and Oklahoma State number 9. It almost is unreasonable to expect much more, but at least the comfort is it is an out-of-conference matchup. So you don't think you're going to win, and if they manage to win conference games, they can turn things around. But it's going to be interesting. Pitt fans are going to be certainly sweating it out in that matchup against Oklahoma State, I'd imagine.
Mike, the double-edged sword of scheduling difficult at non-conference games and not being able to handle them, and when you're going to be on the fence as Pitt would expect to be. So in previous seasons, they've been a pretty solid postseason team. But this year, if you lose 2 non-conference games and then you go 3-5 in the ACC, which they could do, I'm not predicting it. I think I slated them for either 3-5 or 4-4 in the ACC. But if you go 3-5, you're 5-7, and you are out of bowl participation. But
there were some predictors out there in Pittsburgh media, some of my colleagues that were saying Pitt would win 6 games at minimum. They'd go 7-5, 8-4. I don't know what schedule they were looking at. I wasn't with them. I mean, Pitt at almost a great year for Pitt really with this schedule. It's probably a 7-5 year. They are certainly on verge of not making a bowl game or missing a bowl game. If I had to bet money, I think they crawl in. They get 6, maybe 7 wins. But this is a year James Conner's no longer there. There's no longer somebody they can rely on that if they're struggling or they're playing a tough team, they can give him the rock 30 times and say, please crawl us and carry us through this game. There's nobody like that really at Pitt. So unless they can rely on turnovers or penalties, we saw some bad penalties there against Penn State. You're playing these teams like Penn State and Oklahoma State, they're going to expose you if you're an average team and you struggle. That's what Pitt is. They're an average team. They might get 7 wins. You look at the conference play, with the exception of Clemson, that's now a conference that Pitt still could end up 2nd or 3rd in based on the injury with Florida State and Francois. He's out. So that makes Florida State a lot more vulnerable. Miami's good. Clemson's good. But Pitt probably might have an easier time in the ACC than they would have against Penn State or Oklahoma State. You might not actually really see what Pitt is until we get into conference play. So there's almost no way Pitt's going to be beating Oklahoma State. That would be a shocking development. Although a relatively average Pitt team did beat Clemson a year ago, did beat Penn State a year ago. You never know in college football. I'm not going to predict Oklahoma State to go down at the hands of the University of Pittsburgh, but Texas has already lost in the Big 12, so you don't know again.
Yeah, it's a one-game scenario, and it's at Heinz Field, so maybe they've got a puncher's chance, but seems to be a bit bad matchup as well when you consider that Oklahoma State has one of the best passing attacks in college football with Mason Rudolph at the controls and James Washington leading a fleet wide receiver core, and Pitt's been abysmal the last year plus 2 games now in pass defense, and you mentioned James Conner not being there, Juan Price also not being there as kind of an eraser on defense who would put pressure on the quarterback and hide pretty suspect secondary in the past.
Absolutely. And we'll also be able to see the fan base of Pitt and how long they stay in that game, because there was many Pitt fans that were leaving Heinz Field towards the end of the Youngstown State game thinking Pitt already had it on lock and they already locked up that win, when in reality they had to barely win it in overtime. And that 109,000 Pitt saw at Penn State at Beaver Stadium in Happy Valley, they're not even going to see half of that at Heinz Field. I mean, Pitt's looking at 30, 40,000 usually go there. It's a pro stadium. It's in the North Shore of Pittsburgh where the pro stadiums are, PNC Park down the street, Heinz Field there. It's not a college atmosphere. It's not what you would get out of a West Virginia, a Ohio State, a Penn State atmosphere of hundreds upon hundreds of thousand people in the stadium and even out of the stadium tailgating. Not the case. I mean, the atmosphere is just not there. It's not just me being critical. Pitt fans will tell you that's been a fact that they struggle packing Heinz Field. So maybe these out-of-conference matchups against good teams, especially if maybe somehow they could be competitive in those games, and then you go to the conference schedule, that could maybe bring some fans there. I mean, it's Oklahoma State, it's Heinz Field, Pitt coming off the Penn State game, but that's a game to go see. So Pitt fans, if you want to argue on Twitter with us or anybody else that you're still an avid fan base, that's a game to go to. Go to that game. That's a top 10 team. Don't sit at home and let 30,000 people be there. There's 60,000 seats at that stadium, not 100,000, but give it some respectability in terms of the fan base. I want Pitt fans to be interested, and I want them to get more fans at that stadium, but it just seems like it never happened.